Ignacio is the CEO of Genmedica, and he came to this position after a long stint in business development. Christina Takke is the managing partner of Bioventures, and so she'll be able to speak to risk assessment from an investor perspective. And John Hodgson, as editor of Scrip, has seen many a failure over his career. So to introduce the panel a bit, we'll be talking about the industry and why it's known for its high failure rate, but for the sake of a chance at success, obviously. And so we'll go into some of the reasons that companies fail, what's being hidden, and what we should be talking about. So to start off, I think we should first define how we define failure. So John, we spoke a little bit about this over the phone, if you'd like to kick us off.
First failure would be not to speak into the microphone, I guess. I mean, the problem with biotech, and probably it's exactly the same in many other types of companies, there are so many ways not to succeed. There's only one way to succeed. So, I mean, at the start of things, you could fail by not having a good business plan, and that wouldn't probably go any further. You could fail by not executing on a perfectly good business plan. And you could fail also by not taking advantage of the magnitude of the opportunity that was actually there. So that you saw that, you know, a market was over here in this tiny niche area, but in fact, you know, when your company fails because it fails to get funded, someone takes over your intellectual property and finds that they can deploy that intellectual property in an area that's worth, you know, multiple times what you thought it was worth. So that's, you know, 3 types of failure right there. And that's without drilling down into the kind of thing, you know, personal difficulties within a company, overconfidence, not listening to your advisors. Do you want me to keep going on some kind of detailed list? I mean, well, basically what this means is that you either had a bad idea, or you badly executed, or you ultimately had bad luck. And, you know, the bad luck you probably can't do too much about, but the rest of the things you should be able to do something about.
Right. So on the subject of things that we can't really do anything about, Ignacio, you mentioned that most of these companies are science-driven. Again, obvious statement, but that's not, the risk there is much harder to get rid of. Could you talk about other things that we can do things about?
Yes, I mean, well, going back before to what I would like to define what success in these companies is. I think success is basically 2 things. One is that whatever products we're developing, or medical devices or tests, whatever, actually make it to the market and they benefit the patients. At the end, this is the critical aspect of our companies. That's the one thing that I think is success. And the second one is that we do that rewarding financially in a reasonable way those who've taken the financial risk to fund these ventures. So I think you need these 2 things. I think if you're missing one of these, I'm not really sure you have a success story, in the sense that if you sell a company, for example, and that it's a nice multiple for the investors, but then ultimately those products never make it to the market, I'm not sure. You know, it might be a success for a subset of the people involved, but not for all of them. Now, in terms of the things that you can do, well, I think the whole thing is about de-risking your assets the best possible way. The risk will always be there. That's why this is called risk investing. But at the end of the day, when you see these projections about sales and how much money the different products will make if they make it to the end, I don't really look a lot. I don't look a lot at that. I look at, you know, what are the risks and how can we de-risk all of these so that we can make that, you know, have the best possible chance. And unfortunately, you always have to make decisions with limited information and with incomplete information. But that's just part of the nature of the business.
Does anyone want to jump in? Or?
I think a point you made, I think, is very important to see. What is the viewpoint from which you define which is a success and which isn't a success? I think you brought in the aspect of time, looking as an investor. Of course, well, success is defined in your lifetime of the fund, what you can do, what you can sort of return to your investors, which doesn't mean that companies that haven't done well in a circle of the fund, in the long run, have been successful companies. And I think that's what we're going to say is, well, it's the long run which at the end you would like to build a company which is successful, which sustains and which is sustainable in the industry. But in the eye of the beholder, it can be quite different if you talk to early stage investors, later stage investors, which they define as their major success.
Right. But as far as learning from these successes or failures on whichever term, probably in the shortest one, what can we do to make these lessons more transparent such that other companies can learn from them? And I'm talking specifically about clinical failures because those are well known to be hidden and aggressively. So what do we need to actually make this more transparent?
Maybe to start on that one, it's a comment I would make, or something which we realized when looking into a new area where we as an early stage fund would like to invest in. We're looking at other companies, technologies that have been used. And one thing that always strikes me, if you compare the press releases of public companies, and if you then look back into publications which come out on clinical trials, which obviously they come out like a year, 1.5 years later than the press release, you really find data which I think could have been very valuable for the public investors, but they weren't presented at the time either because they weren't there, they weren't scrutinized, and they couldn't be published. But I think to be open and transparent means combining really the company communication with the scientific publication at the end. So that's something, I don't have an answer to it, but it's really a phenomenon which struck us to see, looking back into clinical trials, looking at data, and then looking back what the company has published at the time.
But we're not talking about success and failure in clinical trials necessarily in the detail of that. We're talking about, well, at least I'm talking about success and failure of a company. And part of the success of a company may be that you actually have a failure in-house, but you keep that in-house so that all your competitors carry on and make the same failure, make the same mistake. That doesn't lose you time. If you give away your mistake and you're going to reorientate a lot of the competitors, that may be an unrealistic view, and maybe it's a more cooperative society that we're working out in there. But I think when you've got big pharma or even big biotech looking over your shoulder, they will have internal programs that maybe reflect that are maybe slightly behind your program as a small company. And I'm not sure that you can afford to divulge everything that went wrong. When it goes right, you can put intellectual property around that in a much more convenient way than you can when it goes wrong, although you might want to avoid certain steps. So, it's a question about defining what we mean by success and failure here, and I think I'm talking about corporate success as opposed to product success.
Well, also to add, in terms of the clinical trials I've been involved in, they always take longer and they cost more money than what you think always. Maybe not always, but 90% of the times. So I think a lot of times also in terms of the budgeting, what I find, whenever we budget the clinical trial, I always budget 10% more of whatever the quotes that I have, because I know we're going to need that money, and if not, we might get stuck in a middle of the road situation where we didn't get enough patients, and we have great results that at the end nobody really is comfortable with.
John, going back to what you just said on, well, the clinical success versus company success, I think we all have seen products that have failed clinical trials, which we all thought, well, that's the end of it. But if you then really dig into data, and, well, there have been smart people looking at it, is there a way forward for that product in a different indication? Because knowledge has grown in biomarkers. So it doesn't mean that everything which fails has no right of existence, but not in that way that has been explored. Well, we have seen spin-outs from companies, from large pharma companies. They have abandoned the field. So you would say, well, why it's worthwhile picking it up? But smart people can look around. There are different indications. So I think that's the way where clinical success and company success might diverge in the beginning, but come back at the end.
Yeah, I think there are going to be niche opportunities or even big opportunities if you re-examine the data. I don't disagree with that.
What about commercial success and failure? I'm going to name names and go with Unicure and Glybera. Do you consider that a success or a failure? Because they're now very well positioned with a proof of concept for their programs in hemophilia and congestive heart failure, which is partnered with BMS. So how would you approach that? Or like comment on that from a commercial perspective? Because I think that was the extra step that.
I think in many ways, you'll look back on that and say it was a success. But I'm not talking about from this, from 10 years, 20 years on, in the sense that the problem with being a pioneer is that you're the first along the path, and the fact that you've moved the needle in some way is actually a success for the rest of the industry, whether or not you as that individual pioneer taking all the risks, arguing the case for a particularly specific type of really expensive, almost cure kind of product, whether you ultimately benefit, whether your investors ultimately benefit from that, you can take a wider perspective and say it's a success, even if the company has to change its location, change its funding source, and essentially change the type of product that it's putting forward so that it is reimbursable. It may be that in that case, the money gets spent before that commercial entity, that legal entity, turns a profit, returns investment to its investors, in which case many people will see it as a failure. But the path will be followed by others, essentially.
Yes, I mean, picking up on this, I think there are probably a lot of founders in this room. I'm a founder also, and I think the important thing is to think, if we sit in this room again in 5 years and we say, I'm happy the way things went, my company did well, I mean, what would you want to see? For me, the commercial success is there, but it's less of an issue because, frankly, by the time these companies get divested, most of the times the product is still not in the market. So we don't know what the outcome is going to be. But for me as a founder, I would like to know, we took some products forward. They might be making it to the market, maybe not. Our investors are happy. They got a good return on their investment. We created some jobs. We created some value. And that's what I would like to think 5 years after I founded the company that happened. In terms of the commercial success, for me, as a founder, as long as a handful of patients benefit, it's enough. It's enough. For me, as a founder of the company. For others, it's probably not enough.
Well, maybe deviating a little bit, but the question is, of course, and that's the question of the panel, how to make failures into successes if that's feasible. And the question, and I would like to throw it in the room, for me, the most important thing is how we can ever rescue or make failures into successes is as long as we have still confidence in the people working on that program, because that means, well, you dig into the data, there are data still worthwhile pursuing, but you need to have that confidence into the management team to be able to pick it up and to take it forward. And that's the starting point for me, how we can, if there's value in there, unlock that value and going forward, because you need to convince the investors to further funding or to convince partners to further fund the program. So the confidence for me is one important aspect to make that turn.
I mean, the other thing you can say about uniQure and is that they've come an awful long way. I mean, they did a lot of things right, even to still be existing, when the product was available, because many companies make very many mistakes before that, and they didn't until they may not have made a mistake yet.
So I'd like to go back to investing in people. I know that's something that that's a very common strategy for VCs particularly, but there was something else that you brought up in our previous conversation about communication and how CEOs present themselves, and so I was hoping that you could elaborate on that a little bit further.
Yeah, it's for us an interesting topic because we as an early stage investors, we mainly deal with first-time CEOs. So these people, they need to learn while being on the job and being thrown into the water to communicate. And what we see, there are different levels of communication towards the new investors. So they need to be convinced about their projects, they need to sell the project to make others enthusiasts. But also then in the board, when the company has taken off, to be honest and transparent. And that's, I think, one thing I mentioned and which I really believe in. You have to be transparent in our business. You have to, discuss data when they come in. If internally, we're not discussing to the larger public, but to be on the same line as your investors. If things go right or wrong, because then you can take the right decisions moving forward and not hiding things and then, 3 months, 4 months down the road, you come across it, and the confidence is lost, because then, going back to my earlier comment, so communication for me is an important aspect people need to learn, need to work on.
Yeah, I mean, there's private conversation and private communication, which I think needs to be as open and transparent as possible, and then there's communication to the public in general, or to a wider community. I think you obviously have to be transparent within the group of people who are essentially on the side of the company to start with, because those people don't want to hear what's happening from a different source, and then you lose all credibility. But I think in terms of communicating more widely, I guess for most people in the room, that's probably not an issue yet. You might want to communicate widely, and you may find that disrupts the business communication later, so you might want to look at that now before social media picks up on whatever it is you said in this kind of a conference where we're much more relaxed, and then expands it out, and your potential collaborator in the future gets to hear about it. At the same time, it's really nice to be here and have people exchanging information quite much more openly than I'm used to in the kind of meetings that I go to in the pharma and biotech industry.
Well, in terms of external communication, of course, there's always an issue that you have to deal with. I mean, we're selling expectations, and sometimes the line between fair explanation of the expectation and overdoing it and selling something that's really maybe true but remotely true, it can be a very fine line. So I always prefer to be a bit conservative with everybody, with the shareholders and with the outside people. As I say, I don't like to use this word, but I'll use it. I don't like to bluff the potential of the project and the potential of the assets, because I prefer to be a bit more conservative in my communication to both externally and to the investors.
I think that there's nothing wrong with being conservative and being data-driven. What we see on the other side, it's really a lot of startup companies are led by the scientists, and a lot of times they're really enthusiastic with their science, with their project, and very focused on the details. But what investors would also like to see is, what is your aim? What is the step on the horizon where you want to be in a couple of years down the road with your company, with your technology, and what problems will you going to solve? Which is not overselling, but it's more putting the science into a bigger picture.
It's not wise to start a sentence, the trouble with scientists is, but the trouble with scientists is when they're running companies, they're really interested in the science. I speak with as somebody who's really interested in the science. If I was running a company, I'd be really interested in the science. And that is also probably the first hurdle that you have to overcome. But at the same time, it is not the case that that's the only hurdle, and it's probably not the major hurdle that you need to overcome to take the company forward. You have to be able to form business partnerships, you have to be able to get funding, and you might solve the problems in the science. Eventually, you might go too far, but if you're not taking regular external checks on, have I done enough science? Is it the right science? Then you're getting obsessed with the science. So, that's the trouble with scientists. They're scientists. People in finance, the trouble with people in finance is that they're in finance, and that's what obsesses them. So in a sense, you need the right balance in the management group or the management and investor group, because all of those things are going to become a problem eventually. So, if you have a heavily research-orientated company, that's okay if it's just about asset development, and that's all the company is trying to do, because basically the investors are taking on board all the commercial functions. But it's not okay if the company's going to run out of money spending it on science. So yeah, I went on.
Do you have anything to add? Okay, so we're in the last 10 minutes or so. I just wanted to check if anybody has any questions before I wrap it on. Can we get a microphone for actually several? No one?
People with microphones.
Oh, Tom, you've got the fourth one. No, okay.
Yeah, I just want to make the comment that from an investor's perspective, it's all about how to manage, first of all, the attrition rate, because we are in a business where products will fail. So, you have two possibilities. You can do it in a company, then you have a big company, a platform company, having the possibility to develop several products, or you do it in our portfolio as the investor. So I think then the question is, when is your company a failure? If you have a single asset company, you need to ask yourself, is there a second chance? And if you have more assets, you can jump to the next, hopefully, product in your pipeline. But at the end, what we are trying to do is because we cannot influence the attrition rate, maybe we can, but everybody's claiming it, but I think they are wrong. You try to optimize everything else, the financing, what you said, the management, what Tina said, and then we hope that we will get some of the even failures into successes.
Yeah, actually, that was my, well, I had a question for him of that. No, but there was an observation that I've been kicking around about how there's platform-based companies and then single asset companies, and intuitively you'd want a chicken that has a lot of eggs instead of just like one egg, and then you hope that it hatches. Well, it's a little mixed, but statistically, it's the single asset companies that seem to succeed. Where would you come down on that assessment?
It probably boils down again what you define as a success. And I think Holger gave the answer. Well, a VC might look at it differently than a CEO of a company. As a VC, we look at diversifying over the portfolio. We invest into different companies. And to be honest, well, we as an early stage VC, we like both. We like the asset-centric model because you spend the money on the product. And yeah, you need to make sure that the money is wisely spent, but you take the risk that a product can fall over. If you have a platform company, we also invest in products coming out of that platform, but the platform leans itself for business development, for other activities to diversify your risk. But maybe a CEO of a single asset company will look at it differently.
Ours is a single asset company. So, I think in the single asset company, what happens is you spend all your time thinking about the one asset. In a multi-asset company, you think, well, if the lead compound fails, I'll have another one and I can go on. Here, you only have one, and you're not diversified. By the way, the venture capital firms are diversified because your company is only one of many. You are not. You are just running that one company, and it's not only a company, it's a product. So I think, I really don't know whether they succeed more. You said that, but is there evidence for that? If that's the case, that's a good thing to know. But
it came from one of the partners of Medici.
Okay, well then it's probably true. I mean, as I say, in the single asset company, you spend all of your time thinking about how to de-risk that one asset that you have, and that's your focus, and maybe that's why these companies succeed more. I don't know.
I'm not sure whether the data is really convincing on single asset versus multiple asset companies. I mean, the thing that strikes me about this, it doesn't matter whether you've got one asset or several. If you think that you're in a unique position with that single asset or the platform that you have, you're wrong, because it doesn't matter whether your product succeeds. If somebody else succeeds better than you or circumvents the way that you've tackled the problem, you're in a competitive situation. So one of the characteristics of a company that's setting itself up to fail is going to be the claim that, we have this unique intellectual property. Well, that may be true, but it doesn't mean you have a unique company. The intellectual property, that patent, yeah, that's yours. It's not anybody else's unless you license it out. But it's not the unique approach to the problem that you're trying to solve. Even if it's a single asset company, you can focus all you like on that, but there's still other people coming from different directions, and I think that's something small companies miss sometimes.
And what you're mentioning, you were referring to single asset versus platform, and I think multiple asset companies are maybe still the third animal you have there. At least we at VBio, what we don't like with platform companies are platforms that use a huge amount of capital to run them, to keep them up, to have huge investments in order to get some of these products out of it. We love platforms which are easy to handle, and they can crank out molecules in a very cost-efficient way. But I remember years ago, in the years 2000, we had platform companies that needed 50 people to operate. That's not cash efficient. I think that's what we've learned.
Other questions or comments from the audience?
One in the back, at least. I saw a hand waving.
What's the panel's best example of a specific failure that's been turned into a success?
So it's almost as if I planted that question, but we did discuss it earlier, and I think it's quite difficult to think of the examples. The best one that I came up with, and I don't know whether you'd call the initial stages a failure in the first place, but there was a small UK company called Avidex that got $15 million in initial venture capital round, and then came into a very poor funding period or got squeezed by the venture capitalists, depending on whose story you listen to. But anyway, they weren't so able to raise subsequent cash. They got a £10 million loan at some point in 2004, 2005. 2006, that company and its assets were sold to Medigene, or Medigene, as we'd say in the German company. And then Medigene did some work with some of the assets, the more advanced assets, but there was a whole set of T-cell receptor intellectual property that also came with Avidex. Medigene itself wasn't focusing on that and sold that asset back to basically an Oxford consortium that then became Adaptimmune and Immunocore, both of which raised huge amounts of venture capital before going on to, in Adaptimmune's case, NASDAQ, and raising another huge chunk of capital. Now, whether ultimately Immunocore or Adaptimmune succeed is still out there, we don't know, but they've at least managed to attract hundreds of millions of dollars of additional capital on a piece of intellectual property that wasn't valued first in Avidex and then wasn't valued enough in Medigene.
Does anyone else have a, well, not favorite failure, but it's...
Well, maybe one, and I'm referring to Holger's fund and my previous fund, Forion. Well, we invested years ago in a platform company with Nobel laureate, and they had a new method of screening small molecules which looked fantastic to easily pick them out. Well, we tried and tried, but we couldn't find any molecules really suitable. But they found molecules through really good medicine and chemistry, which at the end became a success. The company developed 2 products and was sold to Amgen. So it doesn't mean that if the technology fails, you can't get products out of it. But you have to have management team being able to stand up and say, well, that's going nowhere. We need to change, and we need to really develop drugs, what we are all up to, and develop good molecules.
So I think that's all we have time for. Any further questions? The speakers will be around after this.